that's a big priority for the Constitution Project at POGO, is finding solutions that are strong to protect our civil rights and civil liberties, but also liable in the types of solutions we can move forward. And I think we have a really fantastic panel to have a discussion that'll help advance that debate. So just to introduce everyone down the line, Harley Geiger is the policy director at Rapid 7. He previously worked at the Center for Democracy and Technology and for United States Representatives of Law Firm, where he worked on drone surveillance policy specifically. Chavis is professor of law and director of the Criminal Justice Program at Wake Forest University School of Law. She has extensive experience writing about criminal law, criminal procedure, and law enforcement, and how we should respond to emerging police technologies and practices. And Billy Easley II is senior policy analyst at Americans for Prosperity, where he focuses on judiciary, technology, and free speech issues. He previously worked at the U.S. Sentencing Commission and for Senator Rand Paul, where he specialized on issues including privacy and criminal justice. So just kind of to put on the line with a set of opening questions to start this discussion off. Harley, what are some of the key protections and principles that we really should be setting out our standards on and aiming for when we think about what type of legislative and policy solutions might be the proper way to approach aerial surveillance?
Thanks, Jake, and thanks to POGO for having me, and thank you everyone for showing up. Many of the policy solutions that we'll talk about are not really new. This problem has been around for a long time, and there's been quite a number of bills, some of which have passed in states and proposed in the federal context that propose similar things. But I break it down first in an overarching way. The goals are twofold. One, protecting individual civil liberties, and then second is promoting trust in the beneficial uses of unmanned aerial surveillance or unmanned aerial aircraft. And those go hand in hand. If there's less privacy, people are worried about their civil liberties and worried about surveillance, then there will be, in some ways, blunt, sort of clumsy policies that lead to less beneficial uses. And here, when it comes to the concerns about surveillance, of course, people are most acutely concerned about law enforcement. So that is where we think that the policies should be focused on law enforcement surveillance. And there's 4 ways in particular that we think you can do this. The first is transparency. And there, what we had recommended in the past was, one, having government agencies that want to use UAS submit data collection statements that has, first, the existence of the fact that they have a UAS capable of picking up identifiable information, and in general, how they intend to use it. And second, requiring those agencies to submit their UAS data collection statement to a publicly accessible database. This is already being done at the federal level for private aircraft. The FAA already does this. The FAA actually is already requiring a lot of small UAS in private hands to register. So it's not too heavy of a lift to think that this can be done for federal agencies. And second is just due process for surveillance. And there are 2 scenarios that I think deserve potentially different protections. One is targeting individuals on private property, so like looking at places that you would normally have a reasonable expectation of privacy in, were it not for the fact that you were looking at them from the air. And second, sort of wide area surveillance of public places. And there are different approaches you can take to require those. Third are back-end protections for the data that is collected. And there, ideally, it wouldn't just be limited to drones, but we've seen some approaches where they do just have special back-end protections for drones. And fourth and last are weaponization limits. So having limits on the use of weapons that can be defined in certain ways, like firearms, for example, on drones by governments, can also apply to private individuals. And so those 4 protections do not necessarily encompass the whole of the surveillance problem. But with those 4 protections in place, you can go a long way to promoting trust and protecting civil liberties.
Cammy, we discussed this a little bit in the last panel, but I want to build on the question of how does surveillance tech like this affect different communities, and I think especially importantly for this panel, how should we be thinking about those differences and disparate impacts as we try to develop law and policy on this topic?
Right, thank you, and again, thank you for having me here and having this panel. I think that we should kind of step back just a little bit and contextualize drones and aerial, other forms of aerial surveillance within the larger body of emerging technologies, some of which have actually been around for a while. And the issues are very much the same when it comes to particularly the communities that I work with, the poor, urban, racial minorities are often disproportionately surveilled, and so technologies like this become even more invasive. So in terms of contextualizing it, in general, I mean, there's an estimated 30 million surveillance cameras already deployed in the United States, over 4,000 law enforcement cameras in Manhattan, for example, alone. And if you were to take each city, lots of cities already have surveillance cameras. And then when you combine that with over a third of police departments using body cameras and the dash cams that have already been equipped in lots of cars, it makes for an incredibly invasive state generally. And so communities of color, which we know have disproportionate contacts with law enforcement, are really on the short end of the stick here in terms of having are over surveilled in that way. So, and when we think about a lot of the things that Harley said, I think can help in terms of those communities. Transparency, when we have communities that are being surveilled in this way, and I'm thinking back to I know we'll talk about it, the program in Baltimore, which actually began a private company partnering with the police department, and the police department not announcing this contract that they had. So that kind of violates, I think, the first rule here of transparency, and which again goes a long way to delegitimizing law enforcement and the eyes of those communities, often need the greatest protection. So there are a lot of different things that I hope we will touch on, but just different questions in terms of the footage that's collected, how is this collected and stored, who's going to have, under what circumstances will it be reviewed and released, how long and under what conditions is it stored. So and then the triggers for this, I think the real distinction when we're thinking about kind of the unmanned surveillance is that there's no triggering condition, it just is there often. And that's something that in other technologies, I think it's a real distinction between that and other technologies, and it just, again, goes to show that there aren't as many limitations on this. So, again, the transparency and community consent. I think that you have to involve communities, and again, if you have the transparency to say we are considering this policy or considering this type of surveillance, and having the community be able to weigh in on the use and on any limitations, then again that can help with legitimizing it in the eyes of the community.
One thing that seems to have been a recurring theme of the discussion today, somewhat disappointingly, is this concept of secrecy. There seems to be so much secrecy surrounding aerial surveillance. So, Billy, I'd like to get your feedback on how do we approach figuring out just not only what should be the appropriate policies and rules for limiting and regulating aerial surveillance, but for actually authorizing in the first place. How should that come into the way we approach this as a policy measure?
Well, I think before I get to that question, it's important to contextualize this by thinking about what are our goals with creating a regulatory framework for aerial surveillance, right? What's our ideal state? What are our first principles? And at Americans for Prosperity, our view of this is we need to have a regulatory framework that promotes innovation from law enforcement leaders, that allows them to come up with policies that reflects their capabilities and their communities, so that they can effectively deter and solve crimes first. Second, we need to do all of that while still defending civil liberties and protecting civil liberties protections. And finally, we need to do all this to the benefit of enhancing public safety, right? Those are our three main points. And I think the way that we achieve that is not through specifically looking towards the federal government or a be-all, end-all bill that decides that lists specific what nuances for how aerial surveillance needs to be done, or set specific minimization standards that needs to be applied broadly to each community. I think what we need is to allow states and localities who are best placed and more closely aligned with the communities to gain community consent and use their community orientation to determine what the best types of drone surveillance policies will be for their specific communities. And through that experimentation, we'll be able to determine what the best practices are. I think it's absolutely right that this is not a new problem. Like, drone surveillance is not new, it's only getting more pervasive. So there are already been a number of states that have already been dealing with this. At AFP, one of my main jobs is analyzing state legislation in all 35 states that we're active in, and there are a lot of bills dealing with drone surveillance in states today. Specifically going to the weaponization point that was brought up earlier, there's a bill in Florida that bans the use of combining weapons onto drones, for instance. So those are just like the first principles that I think I would apply to developing any regulations or rules, specifically just really trying to give law enforcement leaders the ability to come up with strategies that fit with their communities. And going on to the second point about how these rules and regulations should be enacted, I mean, the easiest thing to say is just the opposite of what Baltimore did, but I don't think that's particularly helpful. I just want to highlight two things. It's important that we get this right because there's so many communities that would benefit from drone technology being used in a responsible, community-oriented way. There are so many lives that could be saved, crimes that could be solved that ordinarily would not be. So from the perspective of a policy person who's worked on tech and criminal justice stuff, both in Congress and now in the nonprofit sector, I have this posture of really wanting a deregulatory framework that allows these law enforcement leaders to come up with the proper ways that reflect their communities. On the other hand, as a person of color, I know that government technology has been used to target communities of color for as long as they've had the ability to do so. And I think the only way, well, first, before I move on, I think it's important that people understand that there is not a hard dichotomy choice here between either invasive, persistent surveillance that doesn't care about your civil liberties and safety. We can do this right, and we can do this in a community-oriented way. And I think actually, if we don't do it in a community-oriented way, it's actually going to harm the public trust that people have in law enforcement leaders, and it's going to make it harder for them to serve their communities effectively, and mainly because it's going to make them feel like they didn't have a voice in the process. And then we're just going to have to fix everything on the back end instead of making a credible surveillance regime on the front end. So I think that's what I would see on those 2 points.
Okay, so I think that actually offers a really great segue to just kind of to more group questions. On the one hand, a lot of these programs for aerial surveillance are run at the local level by local police. On the other hand, as was just mentioned, we have a very hodgepodge set of systems for different localities, for different states, and that might make it harder for individuals to know, how often they're under scrutiny from the sky. And we also have a huge amount of aerial surveillance, even if it's run by the localities, coming through federal loan and drone programs, as they're called, or DOJ funding, DHS funding. So what are the different roles for localities, states, and the federal government in figuring out what policies and limits should exist for aerial surveillance?
I should say first, because I don't think I remember you mentioning at the outset. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I work on drone surveillance and privacy in Congress and at the Center for Democracy and Technology, but currently my work is focused on cybersecurity. So In terms of the role for states and localities, the FAA has actually stated publicly, this is their official stance on this, that states should be free to regulate law enforcement use, weaponization, and privacy. There has been discussion about who should have jurisdiction, because technically the federal government owns all the air down to your chickens. And the FAA has said, well, you're really just a safety agency, so when it comes to law enforcement, privacy, weaponization, we're going to leave that up to the states. So they sort of punted to the states. And the states, especially between 2013 and 2016, actually took that and ran with it. And there are something like 33 states that have some form of drone law. If my research is correct, there's something like 130 or so localities that have some form of drone law. Most of these are focused on things like voyeurism and the use of drones to facilitate existing types of crimes. But 18 states have laws that require a warrant for law enforcement use. For example, Virginia, Illinois, Maine. But they also, to Billy's point about wanting to ensure that we leverage good uses of drones, they also have exceptions for things like crash scene photography, wildlife and forest fire management, as well as in circumstances like there's an emergency, there's a hot pursuit. These all make sense to me. Virginia and North Dakota and Maine also have weaponization bans, and Oregon has a specific law for the back-end protections for drones. So states are up and running with it. I think that it's a positive because so far there's been a lot of inertia at the federal level when it comes to drone privacy. When I was working for Representative Laperruque, we and Representative Poe got a bill. Billy was saying that they had worked on a bill with Senator Rand Paul. There was actually plenty of proposals, but they never got anywhere. I don't think they ever received a chamber vote. But the states have been quite active, and so I think that is properly the place to go if you want to see some action.
And so I agree with all that, and again, I think it's kind of, again, very similar to what Billy was saying as well. I think that we go back to first principles, law enforcement should be able to use whatever technologies are available to them in order to keep the public safe within constitutional limits. And so again, and I'm always reminding my students that the Constitution is the floor, and states can experiment, and we will have that type of innovation. But I think I would like to see, because you can analogize this to other programs, if the federal government, for example, is if they're giving money or giving grants to states to augment their programs in some way, then they ought to be able to set certain parameters. And I think that a lot of the ones that we've already talked about in terms of transparency, storage, and the like should be considered, and that there should be some limitations on it. And with community consent being one of the primary goals.
I mean, I think this is one of the boring ones because we all kind of agree on this particular question. But the one thing that I would just highlight is when I worked at Senator Paul's office, we worked on a body camera bill that would have funded grants to different law enforcement agencies for body cameras. And we included transparency provisions, we included minimization standard provisions, requirements about how long they needed to hold the data, who could access it, all done with good government principles involved and transparency principles involved. And what wound up happening is, after the fact, we had a lot of local law enforcement in the state come up to us, which has happened before, but what can you do? Come up to us and say, we would never sign on to this because we're a tiny sheriff's office. We don't have the capability we would have to hire 20 different people to adopt these minimization standards. Or, we would have to contract out the data storage for this. Now, not all cities have this issue, right? But I just think it's important for us to realize this whenever we put on a wealth of minimization standards and all these other standards that these communities have to follow through on, that there's a cost to that. And the cost of that is a lot of these departments might just say, you know what, actually, I don't want to engage in this. It's just not worth the money and time and staff work to do this. And I think that's a bad thing.
So throughout today's events, we've had a lot of discussion, really
mixed discussion throughout of drones, unmanned aerial surveillance systems, and these manned aerial surveillance systems like the persistent surveillance program that do have someone flying the plane, but do also retain this capacity for with very little manpower and effort to really have massive levels of surveillance. Now for states like the ones Harley's mentioned that are putting a warrant requirement for drone, presumably they think if you're monitors from the skies, we want some hard limits on it. Those wouldn't apply at all towards the manned surveillance systems that we talked about. Do you guys think that for localities, states, any entity that's trying to make a law that wants those limits, should they simply be approaching these two systems entirely differently, making rules, or should they try to find a way to adjust the types of bills, laws that we've seen for drones so that they can also fit in these large-scale manned aerial surveillance programs?
Well, for me, I see, I guess, little distinction between whether they're manned or unmanned. For me, it is about the persistence and the ability to surveil. And so to the extent that they are both doing that, I think that the limitations, that anything that we would say is happening with the unmanned should also pertain to the manned. But I'd be interested to see if there are differences.
So I think at a theoretical level, there's no difference. That what you can classify as a UAS or a UAV versus a balloon versus low orbit satellites. There's startups that are working on tiny satellites for private use or manned aircraft. At a theoretical level, there's not really much difference when it comes to the types of surveillance that they can offer. From a practical perspective, there's a major difference, and that's cost. All right, and you can buy a very sophisticated drone for $1,000. There's no way you're going to be able to use a helicopter for the same purpose for that cost level. And so, if you want it to be, really comprehensive and consistent, then yes, go for all types of aerial surveillance. There have been bills that have focused on that. Senator Wyden had one. I think it was in 2015 that covered specifically not just UAS but also manned flights. And that is one route, but there is a difference in the small and more pervasive threat. I think is going to come from unmanned simply because they are so much easier to use.
I have nothing to add to that. That's excellent. I agree with that.
I'd like to jump in then to kind of something we've talked a little bit about already, which is transparency. So I'm curious for everyone's input. With you guys can put your former legislative hats on and your policy making hats on, and if you were a state lawmaker or a congressional or someone in that space, trying to think about how can we end the secrecy and get more transparency on this. I mean, what is on your list, not just in terms of principles, but the specific sort of items that you would like to see have a better light shown on them for these types of activities?
So I'm going to do this, but speaking of hats, I'm going to take off my AFP hat because we do not have a particular point of view policy on that specific question. I'm just going to put on my former Rand Paul hat and talk from that perspective instead. If I was in a position of being a state lawmaker and working on these issues, I think the things that I would most focus on are transparency reports, at least annually, about when drones are being deployed, where they're being deployed, who's being targeted by them, or what location is being surveilled. At the very least, I don't think your question was about transparency, but I kind of feel like I have to put in the front end issue here as well. I think back end stuff is great and necessary, but not sufficient. And that's mostly due from my experience of working on Patriot Act issues. Like, I just think the government is really bad, or at least not really bad. I'll be nicer than that. Not as good as it believes at minimizing data issues generally. So I think the best way to deal with it is by dealing with warrant requirements for one, so that there's a due process standard at the beginning And I think I don't think that would be necessary if it was just dealing with a public, or not dealing with urban communities, or not done in a persistent manner. But if it is, then I think the due process requirement is absolutely necessary. So for me, I think it's both minimization standards on the back end, warrant requirements at the front end. I think those are the two biggest ones that I would look at.
Right, again, and I think that, I guess I would also say from the front end, just like what type of criteria are we talking about? Can you set, if you set forth some criteria for when you're going to use manned versus unmanned, or for certain types of things, and again, that's where I think the community consent comes in, because you can imagine a stakeholder process where you're developing that criteria with the community, who I believe, again, many of the communities that are, as I said in my earlier remarks, disproportionately communities of color being over-surveilled, if you can have a stakeholder process that involves community organizations, community leaders in that process. It's not that communities don't want to be safe and don't recognize value in the technology. It's just about balancing those interests and having an opportunity at the front end to articulate what those are.
My suggestions build off both of those, and I mentioned it in the answer to the first question, which was one, having a system whereby the existence of a drone that can collect personally identifiable information by a government agency is some part of the public record. And the way that we had suggested doing that is requiring a data collection statement, and then whether it's at the state level or the bill we work on is at the federal level, making that part of a publicly accessible database. And the reason we thought that was important in part was to facilitate the type of community engagement that will help build trust and engagement with local law enforcement on the use of the drone. So that it's not a situation where you find out after a story is broken by a journalist, like, oh yeah, this has been used for 5 years and no one knew about it. So making it clear at the outset. Second is some sort of transparency, and Billy mentioned this, some sort of transparency around the use of UAS for wide area surveillance, like pervasive surveillance. And this is a very different use case, I think, than using it in targeted circumstances where you know that the UAS is going to go onto or over private property for the purpose of executing a warrant, for example. But if it is in place and it's looking over a wide area, the people that are in that area, if it's an ongoing matter, should know that that's the case. It should not be the case where you have a secret surveillance that is going on for a long time and folks are not able to know about it. It is a particularly acute problem with drones because it's not like it's up on a pole. It can be very, very small. It can be very, very high. It'll be harder for people to notice. So one, at the front end, will know about the existence of the drone owned by the agency, and second, if their community is under a drone for large scale or wide area surveillance purposes, then they know what that area is.
If you'll indulge me on for just a moment here as well, I mean, I think the other issue is when we have that sort of persistent surveillance or over wide areas that people are unaware of, I mean, we are getting into really murky constitutional waters there, right? I mean, based on where the court is going and analyzing, the Riley versus California issue, I mean, it's clear that, I mean, I've never trusted courts to get it right because that's lawyers would want hard, fast rules, and I think a lot of judges aren't capable of fully understanding the full context of technological issues to get it right, which is why I think policymakers really need to be out front and forward on the state and local level to get this right. That's one of the reasons why I feel like it would behoove local law enforcement who want to even engage in something that gets close to a persistent surveillance state to have the best, most thorough transparency requirements possible so that they don't need to worry about bad law being made in a federal court one day.
So you guys, I think, brought my mind a little bit on my next question was going to be sort of comparing the needs for front end and back end limits. So I'm going to tweak that a little bit and ask, I mean, if the consensus here is that front-end limits are an essential part of limited aerial surveillance, and correct me if that is not anyone's view. Why is that the case? Why would it be insufficient to just have things like, minimization, use limits, and other items like that in the back end alone?
The back-end protections are just not a substitute for collecting it in the first place. We see that in lots of different contexts. We see it when it comes to collection of information by private companies and non-drone collection by government agencies. And once it's collected, then it will get shared. You may have protections in terms of how it gets shared, but it will get shared. You sort of cross the threshold. Even if the agency keeps it forever and doesn't share it at all, the agency can still dip into that pool of data as necessary. If the information is not collected in the first place because, for example, of strong due process requirements, then that eventuality has been foreclosed. But I will say that the back-end protections are still very important. I think that having both together is important. But some states, Oregon specifically, have focused on back-end protections for information that's collected by drones only. I think that this is a mistake. As was mentioned in the previous panel, there are many different data feeds that government is drawing on and collecting where personal information lies. And the back-end immunization and security and use of the restrictions should apply to all of that information. It should not matter if it is taken from the air or if it's taken from a social media account and so forth. So, it has to be specific to drones to get it through the legislature. I guess that's one approach. But ideally, the back-end immunization procedures are not technological specific or technology specific.
Yeah, very little to add other than the fact that because, again, this aerial surveillance is just but one piece of all of this, the different body of technology and the ability to collect information. So the minimizing on the front end the amount and the way in which this information is collected, to me, is the best way to go to, again, the lofty constitutional ideal that we still have some Fourth Amendment right to privacy.
I want to piggyback off about that and about contextualizing the amount of information that you gain from surveillance in this context to all the other contexts, right? Because there's information sharing going between law enforcement agencies, right? I mean, if we do not have substantial front-end protections, then we are going to be substantially increasing the amount of data that law enforcement has to work with. And in some instances, that's perfectly fine. Some of that information should be used. In other instances, especially if it's, in a persistent surveillance context, which is analyzing people and seeing spaces for long periods of time, we should be less comfortable with that. So I think that's one of the reasons why I truly believe that the front end is the most important one to focus on. And I'm just going to pull this out of my behind. I'm not entirely sure about this one, but I also think there's a cultural element to this, right? If we tell agencies that there are due process protections and boxes that need to be checked at the beginning of this process, I think that helps put them in their mindset of like, all right, I need to make sure that before we engage in this surveillance, that it's actually being tied to a legitimate purpose. So I think that's one of the reasons as well why I've always wanted agencies to focus more on the front end rather than the back end.
That's a great point.
Okay, so one that's come up a little bit briefly, but I've also heard a lot in the lead up to this conference is kind of, when we think about government using drones, using planes, the main thing we think about is surveillance, but there are a lot of other uses unrelated to policing and investigating. So I think disaster response was mentioned before, things like response to fires, scientific and technology research, things like that. So, I think, assuming that we don't agree that those things don't really raise rights and civil liberties risks and are fine, how concerned should we be about making sure that we don't inhibit those types of controversial activities as we do start to find limits on aerial surveillance?
Well, I was going to say, I'm not sure that I agree that they don't have civil liberties implications, because I think you could, for example, I think it could, but I think that goes back to my point about setting criteria, and again, having communities weigh in on what criteria are we comfortable having the surveillance, and what you just, the list that you just set forth, I mean, I think would be very good list to start with in terms of saying, all right, you use it in these circumstances, but that is, again, a limiting circumstance, and it's not just for surveillance, just for watching.
I want to talk about the UAS integration pilot program, because I think that's a good example of drugs being used in this way. So Colorado and Montana apply for waivers from the FAA for specific issues, so that they could use drones to, detect fires that are occurring in the state quickly and respond efficiently, right? Like no one has, I certainly don't have a problem with that. I think the one of the best ways to deal with that kind of situation is a criteria kind of plan that you brought up before, right? Like we need to have, I think it's perfectly fine to have a list of non-controversial exceptions that we agree to, but they need to be written correctly and narrowly, because as we've seen in many other contexts, it's very easy to set up a non-controversial provision and for it to be interpreted by departments or even by judges who will defer to agencies that, hey, actually, this is the way it should be read, right? This is a real emergency situation. Or use it as a backdoor way to engage in surveillance that those exceptions were not meant to actually authorize. So, that's one of the reasons why, I've always been a little skeptical of exceptions, because what happens is in the legislative process, once you start down the road of exempting one person or one class of activity, then everybody who has a hobby horse that they want listed as an exception. I think the cure for that is just saying, all right, well, if we're going to have those in, we are going to be extremely specific about those, because the default should be that we're going to have a framework that allows for innovation but has strong due process evaluations at the outset.
Your question was how worried should we be about exempting these? I think that we should be worried. We don't want drone policies that limit the many beneficial uses that don't trigger civil liberties problems. And there are tons of them. And throughout the privacy debate, the pro-UAS companies and trade associations have long lists of what these are, and they're right. There's lots of things that drones can do that are extremely helpful. But from a legislative perspective, it's actually not that hard to carve those out, right? You can limit, you can place limits on use of drones for law enforcement purposes only. You can carve out specific uses like forest management, or crash scene photography. And many states already do this. So I think, yes, it's a good idea in terms of how difficult it is. I actually don't think it's that difficult. There's a lot of examples of it being done at the state and federal level. And it is a worthy piece of any sort of overarching drone surveillance privacy framework.
I definitely could just sit and ask you guys dozens more questions, but I do want to open it up to our audience. So if anyone from the audience has questions that they'd like to ask our panel, please come to mics and go ahead.
So I have a comment and a question. The comment is that the Homeland Security Grant Program, if anybody, state, local, tribal, territorial first responders submits a request to use funding for an unmanned aircraft, they are required to submit their civil rights policy, their civil liberties policy, their privacy policies, and they have to cover issues of transparency, data retention, data minimization, all those kinds of things. And that's only been the case for about a year and a half. And I believe there have been about 50 applications that have been reviewed under that process. The question is, so the Federal Aviation Regulations, Part 119 deals with aerial surveys and aerial photography, and it gives exceptions to allow private pilots to do it under Part 91 or commercial under Part 135. Is there a way of getting surveillance to be seen as surveys and aerial photography and somehow just revise the federal aviation regulations to cover this? And might that be an easier way to resolve the issue?
Your question focused on FAA regulations. I think the FAA doesn't want to touch it. I think that's the reality of it. They very much have been very adamant that they are a safety organization and that privacy outside of safety is not something that they want to take on. That may change, and there is legislation sort of perennially that would give them more oversight responsibilities when it comes to privacy. But I think that just tweaking FAA regulations is probably going to meet with resistance from that agency. It may work better with DHS, as you had suggested at the beginning of your question, or with the Department of Transportation, which has a sort of broader remit. But I think FAA regulations alone are probably going to be difficult.
You said better than I could.
Especially going on the panel, actually.
Yeah.
Quoting different bodies of law.
I'll jump in with another question, which is, I feel like always the unfair question that comes towards the end of a conference, which is about advocacy strategy, in the sense of, I think we've been sitting here all day and hearing about the real problems that are presented by this, and that there's been a few, states who've been acting on this in one way or another, and a few municipalities who've been acting on this one way or another. But even within the civil liberties community, I don't think everyone's even really aware of the extent of these challenges, which then creates the problem of like, well, how do we get from here to there, right, of where we're wanting to go? Is this an effort, at the municipal and state level? Are we trying to mobilize public opinion, or do we think that's a lost cause and this has to be kind of more of an elite effort? The courts don't seem to be picking up because of some of the reasons that have been talked about earlier, where the government's not even disclosing that they're using these tools in court cases, so it's unclear that the courts are the avenue to go on this one. And so I'm not expecting you to have, some really clear answer, but I'd love, particularly those of you also who had legislative experience on this, on bills that didn't move, what were the reasons for that? What would need to change for it to go forward? What's the strategy? And you can take any slice of that you want.
I'll go first, I suppose. So speaking solely from my experience in the federal sector, I've always thought that there's just way too much of a focus on passing bills on the federal level. I think it's much more substantive and a lot easier and doable for people who want to create best practices on specific rules and regulations to go on the state and local level and advocate. Your voice is easier to be heard if you do that. It carries more weight if you're a constituent versus if you're one of 1,000 people who's coming out to a congressional office every week or during one of the prime weeks when people visit. So I mean, if you care about these sorts of issues, and the two things, the best ways to deal with this is to advocate before your local law enforcement department and say, hey, listen, I care about this issue and this set of best practices that I actually believe in, and working on the community level and building up from that, rather than focusing on the federal level and going down from there. And the last thing I'll add to this point is, when I worked on criminal justice issues, this is the way that they succeeded in that front, right? They worked on the state level first, got bills passed on this issue, people saw that the sky didn't fall as a result of these reforms, and then that gave people credibility and the space to advocate for changes on the federal level if they wanted to engage in it. So I'm not going to the merits of any potential reform on this topic, but I mean, strategically, that's the sort of way that I've always looked at these things.
Yes, and I do think, so there's something that you said in terms of the courts. I don't think that the courts are going to, eventually, of course, they will need to weigh in. I don't think that the courts are going to be able to solve some of these existing challenges because the technology is moving more quickly than the courts are able to catch up to, which is why I think it is best handled at a legislative level. And so I agree with Billy's comments, and the local level is typically the way in which you can move more quickly. And having said that, I also think that I think the general public has really, is having a better idea of all of the surveillance that surrounds us, but I think that the general public almost has no idea how incredibly pervasive it is. And so I would like to see more education in terms of, again, this idea of, everybody knows that we have a camera here or drones here, but what we call kind of the mosaic theory of the Fourth Amendment, that once you piece all of that together, and it's just when we were talking about this report, it's probably been mentioned here earlier today, but that the FBI has 50% of us on facial recognition. I think that once the general public begins to understand that and really can be educated about what that means, that gives the agency then to say, well, I'm either okay or not with the balance that can be struck between having that information and the impact on public safety. And I also think that we need more studies and information on the efficacy of some of these programs, because without that, we are just collecting the data without the data and information about a person, their whereabouts, to what end.
I think all of that is absolutely right. State and local engagement, and you will probably get a lot more bang for your buck. Community engagement is going to be really key. And one of the values, the value that conferences like this have is a for advocacy strategy. You've got now several hours of rhetoric framing the problem, rhetoric and information framing the problem, and as well as policy ideas, if not solutions that you agree with, that you can draw upon. There's a good foundation there for taking, shaping your advocacy strategy, your framing of the problem, your framing of the solutions, and engaging on the state and local level. The only real thing that I would add to what my co-panelists have already said is that a special note for journalists. I know that there was at least a couple in the audience previously, if not now, and that is to also talk about some of the solutions that have been proposed. There are lots of news stories that only talk about the problems. In this room, that's when I was working on the Hill, there would be news stories that would come out that would say things like, oh, there's more and more drones that are filling up the sky, and this is a real problem, the Fourth Amendment is really going to suffer. And they would not mention anything about the fact that there was maybe 6 active drone bills in Congress. Sometimes the news stories would even say Congress should do something. And the comments would say, well, why doesn't Congress do something? Well, Congress is doing something, right? But if for people to actually rally around a solution or to evaluate a solution on some merits, they have to know that that solution is out there, and they should know that people are in fact working on it. So I would just urge you in your description of the problems to also talk about solutions, whether they're already proposed in the legislature or whether they're being advocated for at the community level.
I think that's a great way to finish up. Thank you so much, guys, for a really great discussion.